Let the world tremble before the might of Persia.
Imagine a man so convinced of his own power that when the sea disobeyed him, he had it whipped. Not metaphorically literally, 300 lashes to the waves. This wasn't the act of a madman, but of a ruler who believed himself divine, a king so drenched in pride that he thought even nature should kneel before him. This is the story of Xerxes I, the Persian emperor who tried to punish the sea and ended up being punished by history. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historianware. We bring you the human madness behind the world's greatest empires. Xerxes I ruled one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. Persia stretched from modern-day India to Egypt, from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf. His armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. He commanded wealth, land, and power beyond comprehension. To his subjects, he wasn't just a ruler, he was almost a god. His word was law, his image was worshipped. And like many men who live in the shadow of their own greatness, Xerxes began to believe it. When he looked at the map, Greece was just a tiny cluster of rebellious city-states. To him, they weren't even a threat, they were an insult. His father, Darius the Great, had tried to invade Greece years earlier, but failed after the disastrous Battle of Marathon. That loss had left a mark, not just on Persia's pride, but on Xerxes' personal legacy. He wanted revenge. He wanted to prove that Persia ruled not only men, but fate itself. To invade Greece, Xerxes had to cross the Hellespont narrow strait, separating Asia from Europe. It was a simple stretch of water, but to an emperor who saw himself as divine, it was a challenge to his authority. He ordered his engineers to build a massive bridge of botsa, floating highway, so that his army could walk across the sea like gods. The project was enormous, involving thousands of ships and tens of thousands of workers. Engineers tied boats together with ropes, laid planks across them, and built railings to form a causeway spanning more than a kilometer. But nature doesn't bow to ego. Before Xerxes' army could cross, a violent storm struck the Hellespont. The winds howled, the waves rose, and the entire bridge was torn apart. The sea swallowed it, as if mocking the emperor's ambition. For any reasonable ruler, this would have been a moment of frustration, a setback. Nothing more, but Xerxes didn't see it that way. In his mind, this wasn't just a natural disaster. It was rebellion. The sea, a part of his empire in spirit, if not in name, had dared to disobey him. And so, in one of the most bizarre moments in recorded history, Xerxes ordered his men to punish the sea. Ancient sources describe how he commanded his soldiers to flog the water with whips, 300 lashes in total. They hurled chains into the waves as a symbol of enslavement, shouting curses at it as if the sea could feel pain. Some even say he ordered the branding of the water with hot irons, an impossible gesture meant to mark the sea as a punished slave. It sounds absurd now, but to the people who witnessed it, this wasn't comedy. This was divine justice, or, at least, that's what Xerxes wanted it to look like. He wanted his men to see that not even the gods could defy him. He needed to project total control, not just over his empire, but over existence itself. The flogging of the sea was propaganda performance of absolute authority. But underneath the theatrics, this act revealed something dangerous. Fear. Xerxes ruled an empire built on obedience. His generals, nobles, and soldiers didn't dare question him. When power becomes that absolute, every failure becomes personal. To admit defeat even to nature was unthinkable. So, instead of accepting the loss, Xerxes reframed it. The storm wasn't a failure of planning. It was the rebellion of the sea, and he, as emperor, would make an example of it. After the flogging, Xerxes ordered the bridge rebuilt bigger, stronger, and even more ambitious. Thousands of workers were forced to labor under threat of execution. This time, the engineers succeeded. The new pontoon bridge stretched across the strait like a defiant scar. When it was finished, Xerxes led his massive army across it, not as a humble man crossing a passage of water, but as a god walking upon the world he claimed to own. The image of that crossing became one of the most striking in ancient history. Imagine it, a sea of soldiers, archers, cavalry, chariots, servants marching across the floating bridge for days on end. The sound of drums and marching feet filled the air. The sun glinted off armor and spears. Behind them trailed an endless supply chain of food, animals, slaves, and war machines. From the shore, it must have looked as if the earth itself was moving into Greece. But beneath that spectacle was irony. The very sea he thought he'd conquered would later contribute to his downfall. At the Battle of Salamis, the Greek navy, using their smaller, faster ships, lured Xerxes' massive fleet into narrow waters and destroyed it. The same waters he once punished for defying him would soon swallow his ships whole. The god-king who had whipped the sea would be humbled by it again. This moment flogging the sea wasn't just a bizarre footnote in history, it was a perfect symbol of hubris. In Greek, hubris meant not just pride, but the kind of pride that challenges the gods and invites destruction. The Greeks saw Xerxes' actions as proof of what happens when a man confuses himself with divinity. Nature doesn't take orders, and history doesn't bow to ego. Xerxes' obsession with control over the natural world mirrored his rule over his people. He governed through fear and spectacle. He built enormous palaces, demanded impossible tributes, and punished failure with cruelty. The sea flogging wasn't an isolated act, it was the mindset of an empire built on intimidation. He didn't just want victory, he wanted worship. It's easy to laugh at the image of soldiers whipping waves, but it also reveals something deeply human about power. The higher someone climbs, the more terrified they become of losing their grip. Xerxes' paranoia was not unlike that of modern leaders, who blame fate, enemies, or nature for their failures. His punishment of the sea wasn't just about arrogance, it was about fear of appearing weak. And for a while, it worked. His soldiers crossed the rebuilt bridge. His armies conquered northern Greece. Cities fell before him. But the very arrogance that made him whip the sea would blind him later. When faced with the cunning strategies of the Greeks like Themistocles' trap at Salamis, couldn't he imagine losing? He had built his empire on the illusion of invincibility. When that illusion shattered, so did Persia's power in the West. What began as a symbolic act of domination ended as the perfect metaphor for Xerxes himself. The man who tried to enslave the sea would be remembered not for his conquests, but for his foolishness. His empire remained powerful for a time, but his name became synonymous with excess and pride. When ancient historians told this story, they didn't do it to mock Xerxes, they did it to warn future rulers. The flogging of the sea became a timeless lesson in the dangers of believing your own myth. No matter how large your empire, no matter how great your army, there are forces nature, chance, time that no man can command. Xerxes' failure wasn't that he lost to Greece, it was that he thought he could never lose at all. That single act of flogging the sea revealed the seed of his own destruction. The storm that tore down his bridge wasn't defiance, it was a reminder. The world doesn't bend to the will of one man, and the moment he forgot that, his fate was sealed. And that's how the most powerful emperor on earth turned a storm into a statement of madness. His bridge was rebuilt, but his legacy cracked forever. If you want more stories like this, where power meets its breaking point and arrogance meets its meerdone. Forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian, because history isn't just about what happened, it's about what it tried to teach us, even when kings refused to listen. Xerxes believed that sheer numbers were a weapon of their own. He marched into Greece with an army so immense that ancient writers described it as drinking rivers dry and shaking the earth beneath its march. To Xerxes, this display of scale was itself a victory, a symbol that resistance was pointless. He saw his army not as a fighting force that required intelligent use of terrain or tactics, but as a tidal wave meant to crush everything before it through the sheer weight of numbers. Yet this same confidence became his downfall, because it blinded him to the one truth that every seasoned commander understood. A battle is not won by numbers alone, but by the mind that directs them. When Xerxes looked at the map of Greece, he saw narrow valleys and mountain passes as obstacles to his march, not as potential traps for his army. His generals warned him that the terrain of Greece favored defense, especially at the narrow coastal pass of Thermopylae, a place so tight that only a few hundred men could fight side by side. But Xerxes dismissed these warnings as cowardice or exaggeration. He believed that any force, regardless of terrain, could be crushed if he threw enough men at it. This blindness to strategy, the refusal to adapt to the ground, to weather, or to morale, was the fatal flaw that turned his vast army into an uncoordinated horde. Leonidas, by contrast, saw what Xerxes could not. He understood that terrain could serve as an equalizer. A narrow pass like Thermopylae would nullify the Persian numerical advantage. forcing them to fight in close quarters where discipline, armor, and training mattered more than head count. Xerxes' assumption that numbers alone determined victory was shattered by the first clash of spears. The Spartan phalanx was built for that kind of battle, shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield. They formed an impenetrable wall of bronze and muscle, pushing back wave after wave of Persian soldiers who had been taught to rely on speed and mobility. The early battles at Thermopylae exposed Xerxes' failure to grasp the difference between intimidation and efficiency. His army looked impressive from afar, a sea of men stretching beyond the horizon, but in the cramped throat of the pass, only a few hundred could fight at once. The rest were forced to wait, watching their comrades die, unable to maneuver or even see the enemy. Xerxes had turned his greatest strength into a liability. He had created a situation where his army's size worked against him, clogging the pass, disrupting coordination, and reducing morale. Ancient warfare was not simply about killing more enemies, it was about maintaining formation, cohesion, and morale. The Spartans, trained from boyhood to move as one, could fight for hours without breaking their line. The Persians, used to fighting in open plains, were thrown into chaos in the confined space. Xerxes' officers tried to rally their men, but the geography made command nearly impossible. Orders were lost in the noise. Archers couldn't find clear shots, and cavalry, one of Persia's greatest assets, was completely useless. The narrow pass stripped Xerxes of every advantage he had counted on. It wasn't that Xerxes lacked information. His scouts had warned him. His Greek allies, coerced into service, had told him that Thermopylae was a trap designed for defense. Yet he ignored them because his pride refused to acknowledge that a smaller army could stand against him. This arrogance went beyond confidence. It was a blindness born from power. Xerxes had never been forced to question his own assumptions, as the king of kings, surrounded by advisors who feared contradicting him. He mistook obedience for agreement and reverence for wisdom. When one general timidly suggested that the terrain would favor the defenders, Xerxes reportedly laughed and said, "My men will block out the sun." To him, numbers were not a risk, they were proof of divine favor. In that moment, he failed to realize that leadership requires listening as much as commanding. A wise general studies the enemy and adapts. Xerxes simply expected the world to bend to his will. That refusal to adapt turned the invasion into a slow, grinding failure. Even when his forces finally found a way around the Spartan position through Ephialtes' betrayal, the damage had already been done. The delay at Thermopylae gave the Greek city-states precious time to unite, organize, and prepare their fleets. Xerxes' blindness to terrain and timing cost him far more than soldiers. It cost him the psychological momentum of the campaign. The Persians who survived Thermopylae returned with stories of horror and awe. They spoke of Spartan soldiers fighting with calm precision, even when outnumbered 100 to 1. They described how the Greeks sang before battle, as if death were an honor. These stories spread through the Persian ranks like a virus. The army began to fear the Greeks, not for their strength, but for their conviction. Xerxes' failure to respect the enemy's culture of courage destroyed his army's morale, as surely as any sword or spear. To understand how severe this blindness was, imagine a modern general who sends tanks into a swamp because he assumes their armor will make them invincible. Xerxes made the same mistake. He used his army like a blunt instrument, throwing it against the walls of Spartan discipline again and again, expecting brute force to solve what was fundamentally a tactical problem. The Persians had archers, cavalry, engineers, and massive resources. They could have used these advantages to surround or outmaneuver the Greeks. But Xerxes, too proud to delay or reconsider, ordered frontal assaults that achieved nothing but slaughter. The losses were staggering. The narrow ground turned every advance into a bottleneck. Thousands died without ever striking a blow, trampled by their own comrades or driven into the sea. Yet Xerxes still believed he was winning. His ego filtered every setback as temporary, every failure as the fault of his subordinates. This mindset, common among rulers who have never faced true resistance, ensured that he learned nothing from his mistakes. When a leader refuses to see, even clear evidence becomes invisible. The lesson here is larger than Thermopylae. It is a warning about what happens when power outgrows perception. Xerxes' downfall began long before his army met the Spartans. It began when he surrounded himself with yes men, when he started believing his empire was too large to fail, and when he mistook fear for loyalty. By the time he realized that his numbers could not break the Greek line, it was too late. The Spartans had already made their stand immortal. Every step of the battle was proof that arrogance distorts judgment. Xerxes had the resources to win, but not the humility to use them wisely. The terrain? What Leonidas understood instinctively, Xerxes could never grasp that courage, guided by strategy, always triumphs over pride, guided by numbers. The pass at Thermopylae became the graveyard of Xerxes' assumptions. The rivers he thought his army would drink dry instead ran red with the blood of his soldiers. In his mind, he had brought the might of Asia to crush a small, fractured land of rebels. In reality, he had walked willingly into a lesson that would echo through history that the blind pursuit of dominance without understanding leads not to victory, but to humiliation. Xerxes' fatal blindness was not just a military mistake, it was the inevitable result of believing that power alone makes one invincible. In the narrow pass between mountain and sea, that illusion died, and the myth of Persian invincibility died with it. Picture this: the largest army the world had ever seen. Hundreds of thousands of Persian soldiers brought to a complete stop by just 300 men. Xerxes I, the self-proclaimed god king of Persia, sat watching in disbelief as the Spartan phalanx at Thermopylae held his unstoppable force at bay. For 2 full days, wave after wave of his elite troops slammed into the narrow pass, and each time they were shredded by a wall of bronze and discipline. The god king's patience was wearing thin, and that when a Greek traitor named Ephialtes appeared offering a secret that would change the battle and expose Xerxes' most dangerous flaw, his ego. Before we get into that, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian, where we uncover the smartest moments that went horribly wrong. By the 3rd day at Thermopylae, Xerxes' army was exhausted and demoralized. His immortals, the elite Persian guard who had never known defeat, had failed to break through. Every assault ended the same way: Spartans holding firm, Persian bodies piling high. It wasn't just a tactical failure, it was personal humiliation. Xerxes believed himself to be divinely chosen, the living embodiment of order. To see a handful of Greeks resist his might was an insult he couldn't tolerate. His generals advised caution, suggesting patience, siege tactics, or waiting for the Spartans to run out of supplies. But Xerxes didn't want patience. He wanted revenge. He wanted a spectacle of domination. And then, as if summoned by his pride, a local man named Ephialtes appeared. Ephialtes was a Greek from the region, and his motives were as small as Xerxes' ego was large. He wanted gold, safety, and recognition. He told Xerxes he knew of a hidden mountain path and a Pia trail that led behind the Spartan position. Through that path, Xerxes could send troops to flank Leonidas and trap his army from both sides. It was the perfect betrayal offered on a silver platter. But here's where the real stupidity began. Xerxes didn't pause to verify the claim. He didn't send scouts, nor did he consult his Greek advisors or local allies who could confirm the path's existence. He didn't even consider that it might be a trap. To him, Ephialtes' offer was not information, it was a gift from fate. His arrogance blinded him to the possibility that a random traitor might be unreliable. Xerxes' hatred for the Spartans burned so bright that he accepted the traitor S-word without question. Imagine that moment. The most powerful man on earth commanding a vast army. Led by experienced generals choosing to trust a desperate nobody simply because that nobody promised him quick glory. His decision wasn't strategic, it was emotional. Xerxes' need to prove his godlike dominance overrode logic. Instead of finding a sustainable military solution, he chose the fastest route to humiliation, disguised as victory. That night, under the cover of darkness, Xerxes sent his immortals along the hidden path. Ephialtes led them through the mountains, over rocky terrain, and behind the Spartan camp. It worked exactly as he had promised. The Persians surrounded Leonidas' men. The next morning, when the Spartans realized what had happened, they knew they were trapped. But instead of retreating, they fought to the death, choosing honor over surrender. To Xerxes, it must have felt like triumph. He had broken the unbreakable Spartans. He had taken revenge for 2 days of humiliation. But in reality, he had just made one of the most costly and short-sighted decisions of his career. The victory at Thermopylae was hollow. Yes, the Persians won the battle, but they lost the war that followed, and this decision played a major part in that outcome. Here's why. Xerxes' generals, particularly those with experience in Greek warfare, knew that the Spartans' resistance at Thermopylae wasn't the main threat, it was symbolic. The real problem was the unity and morale of the Greek city-states. Every day that the Spartans held the pass was a message to Greece. Persia could be stopped. Xerxes' desperate need to crush Leonidas as quickly as possible turned that message into legend. By killing the Spartans through betrayal instead of brute strength, he gave Greece a martyr storia rallying cry that would echo across every city-state. His short-term win became long-term poison. Instead of intimidating the Greeks into submission, Xerxes' victory inspired them to fight harder. The story of the 300 spread faster than his army could march. Greek morale soared. Ordinary citizens who once feared Persia now believed that courage could defeat an empire. Now, let's step into the mind of Xerxes for a moment. This was a man who believed his power was absolute. He viewed loyalty as something that could be bought. In his empire, obedience was enforced through fear, gold, and spectacle. So, when Ephialtes offered him betrayal for gold, Xerxes saw nothing wrong with it. He saw it as proof of his divine pull-proof that even the Greeks would sell their souls to serve him. In his mind, the universe itself bent to his will. That's why he never questioned the traitor's motives. But think about what this act revealed. By trusting Ephialtes over his own generals, Xerxes sent a message to his army: betrayal pays, and wisdom doesn't. That decision corroded his command structure. Generals who had spent decades studying warfare realized that their advice meant nothing compared to flattery. Soldiers saw that a traitor could gain the king's ear faster than loyalty could. The rot of mistrust began to spread through his ranks, a slow decay that would haunt Persia in the wars to come. From a purely tactical standpoint, Xerxes' decision also made no sense. The terrain at Thermopylae was narrow by design. It neutralized his army's advantage in numbers. The longer he waited, the more likely the Spartans would run out of food and energy. Patience would have led to an easy victory with minimal losses. But patience doesn't feed ego. So instead, he burned through his elite troops, wasted manpower, and celebrated a Pyrrhic victory that cost far more than it gained. Ephialtes, meanwhile, got his gold but not his peace. The Greeks declared him a traitor, and his name became synonymous with betrayal. He was hunted and killed later, despised even by those who benefited from his treachery. And in the end, Xerxes gained nothing lasting from trusting him. The path he used to flank the Spartans became the same route that symbolized his moral weakness. When you look at this decision in context, it's not just about poor strategy, it's about psychology. Xerxes didn't just want to win, he wanted to erase the humiliation of being defied. His entire empire was built on the illusion that he was beyond failure. But Thermopylae exposed a truth that his pride couldn't handle. Sometimes, no matter how big your army is, there's someone smaller, hungrier, and braver standing in your way. Ephialtes offered him a shortcut around that truth, and Xerxes, desperate to protect his ego, took it. This pattern shows up again and again in history. Leaders blinded by their own greatness often choose comfort over wisdom, flattery over truth, and quick fixes over strategy. Xerxes' trust in the traitor was one of those moments. It wasn't just a military blunder, it was the collapse of critical thinking under the weight of ego. He could have waited and won cleanly, but instead, he let vanity decide the course of an empire. And while the Persians marched on to burn Athens later that year, the shadow of Thermopylae followed them. When the Greeks crushed Persia's navy at Salamis, and later their army at Plataea, the memory of Leonidas' sacrifice burned brighter than any Persian victory. Xerxes' decision to trust a traitor had handed Greece its greatest weapon: belief. In trying to prove he was a god, Xerxes showed the world he was just a man impatient, insecure, and desperate for validation. That's what made it dumb. Not the betrayal itself, but his blind faith in it. A god doesn't need to cheat to win. But Xerxes did, and that's how the most powerful man on earth was fooled by one of the weakest. History remembers Ephialtes as a traitor, but it remembers Xerxes as the fool who trusted him. If you want more stories about empires that fell not from defeat, but from their own arrogance, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian. Because every great downfall starts with one bad decision and one man who thought he was too smart to make it. After Thermopylae, Xerxes believed that victory was inevitable. The Spartans were dead, Athens was in flames, and the Persian army still numbered in the hundreds of thousands. To him, Greece was broken, and its remaining resistance was nothing more than a formality. But pride has a way of setting its own trap. Xerxes wanted a final, dramatic, victory-crushing naval triumph that would erase the memory of Thermopylae's defiance and display his dominance before all of Asia and Greece alike. That need for spectacle, for absolute victory, led him straight into the disaster at Salamis. The Persian fleet was enormous, assembled from every corner of the empire: Phoenicians, Egyptians, Ionians, and Cypriots, over 1,000 ships strong. It was a floating city of warriors and slaves, a vast, glittering armada meant to embody the will of the great king. The fleet's size was its own message. Resistance was futile. Yet in warfare, as at Thermopylae, the environment often decides who wins, not the numbers. Xerxes ignored that truth again. He assumed that his overwhelming naval power would simply crush the smaller Greek fleet. What he did not understand was that the narrow straits of Salamis were not a battlefield suited for massive forces. They were a trap, perfectly designed for precision, discipline, and cunning. Themistocles, the Athenian general, knew Xerxes' character. He knew the Persian king would choose pride over patience. Themistocles understood that if he could provoke Xerxes into attacking within the straits, the sheer size of the Persian fleet would work against it, just as it had at Thermopylae. He sent messages to Xerxes, pretending to be a traitor, claiming that the Greek alliance was collapsing, and that now was the perfect time to strike. It was exactly what Xerxes wanted to hear. He ordered his fleet to sail into the narrow waters between Salamis and the mainland, eager to deliver the killing blow. From his throne on the hillside overlooking the sea, Xerxes watched the battle unfold, expecting a massacre. Instead, he witnessed chaos. The Persian fleet, spread across a vast expanse of sea, tried to cram into the confined space of the straits. The wind and currents worked against them. Their long, heavy ships collided, their oars tangled, and their formation dissolved almost immediately. The Greek triremes, smaller and faster, used the confusion to their advantage. They darted in and out of the chaos, ramming Persian ships broadside, breaking their oars, and sinking them before retreating into the narrow lanes where the larger vessels could not follow. Themistocles had chosen his ground perfectly. The Greek crews knew the local waters. The Persians did not. The narrow straits amplified every mistake and punished every delay. Commands from Persian officers couldn't reach their ships in time, and with so many different languages among the crews, communication broke down entirely. It became every captain for himself, a swarm of ships pushing and shoving for space, crashing into one another in panic. Meanwhile, the Greeks moved like a single organism, organized, calm, efficient. The Persians were used to fighting in open seas, where their superior numbers could spread out and surround the enemy. But at Salamis, their numbers became a curse. Their own ships blocked each other's movement, their speed was useless, and their momentum worked against them. The wind funneled through the narrow channel, forcing the larger ships into the rocks. Archers couldn't aim properly in the tight space, and Marines had no room to board enemy ships. What Xerxes thought would be a grand display of power turned into a floating massacre. One by one, the Persian ships began to sink, the sea filled with broken timbers, shattered oars, and the screams of drowning men. Themistocles' forces pressed the attack, striking in waves and retreating before the Persians could regroup. The Athenian triremes struck the flanks, while the Spartans and Corinthians held the line in the center. As the sun rose higher, the waters of Salamis ran red, and the Persian fleet began to collapse in on itself. Xerxes watched in disbelief from his golden throne, unable to comprehend how his grand armada was being torn apart by a force one-third its size. The most humiliating part for Xerxes was that he had been warned. His own advisors, including the experienced naval commanders from Phoenicia, had advised him against fighting in the straits. They wanted to draw the Greeks into open water, where a maneuvering room would allow their superior numbers to encircle them. Artemisia, the queen of Halicarnassus and one of Xerxes' most capable commanders, openly told him it was a trap. She urged him to hold back and wait for the Greeks to scatter or starve. Xerxes ignored her, confident that sheer might would compensate for any tactical disadvantage. When the battle turned, Artemisia's ship even rammed a Persian ally to escape, tricking the Greeks into thinking she had changed sides. Xerxes, watching from afar, thought her maneuver was brilliant and praised her never, realizing she had just sunk one of his own. By the time Xerxes understood the scale of the disaster, it was too late. Nearly half of his fleet was destroyed or disabled, Thousands of his best sailors and marines were dead. Those who survived were in disarray, terrified, and demoralized. His fleet, once the pride of the empire, now floated in ruins, scattered across the straits of Salamis. Themistocles had done what Leonidas had done at Thermopylae. He had turned terrain into a weapon. Xerxes' arrogance had handed him another catastrophic defeat, one that no amount of propaganda could disguise. The psychological impact was devastating. For the Greeks, Salamis was more than a victory. It was proof that the Persian Empire was not invincible. For Xerxes, it was a shattering blow to his confidence and authority. The same king who had believed himself chosen by the gods to rule the world was now forced to face the limits of his power. His navy had been the backbone of his invasion. It supplied his army, ferried reinforcements, and ensured communication between Asia and Europe. With that fleet crippled, his entire campaign was suddenly at risk. In the aftermath, Xerxes had to make a difficult choice: stay in Greece and risk losing everything, or retreat and leave a portion of his army behind to maintain the illusion of control. Pride clashed with pragmatism. In the end, he chose to retreat. He left behind a large force under Mardonius to continue the fight, but the great invasion that had once been the terror of the Greek world was effectively over. Salamis had broken its spine. The defeat also revealed the deeper problem within Xerxes' command structure. His empire was vast, but its unity was superficial. His army and navy were made up of conquered peoples, each with their own languages, traditions, and loyalties. At Thermopylae, that diversity had already been a weakness. At Salamis, it became fatal. Different contingents blamed each other for the loss. The Phoenicians accused the Ionians of cowardice. The Egyptians accused the Phoenicians of treachery. The morale that once depended on Xerxes' aura of divine power collapsed. He was no longer seen as invincible. He was just another man who had been outsmarted by the Greeks. Salamis also revealed something deeper about warfare, that intelligence and adaptability matter more than scale. Themistocles had studied his enemy's psychology and used it as a weapon. He manipulated Xerxes' pride, knowing that the king could not resist the lure of a grand theatrical victory. Xerxes, used to absolute obedience and blind submission, could not imagine that anyone would dare to deceive him. His ego was the lever that Themistocles used to move an empire. In the end, Xerxes' grand naval miscalculation was not just a tactical error, a reflection of his entire worldview. He believed that the world could be conquered through intimidation, that fear could replace understanding, and that size could substitute for wisdom. The sea at Salamis proved otherwise. Power, when misused, becomes weakness. The same ships that had once represented the might of Persia now lay broken and burning in the waves. A graveyard of arrogance. As Xerxes turned back toward Asia, leaving his wounded empire behind him, he carried with him the bitter understanding that his own pride had undone everything he had built. The greatest king of his age had been defeated, not by greater numbers or greater strength, but by a man who understood how pride blinds the powerful and how strategy, not scale, decides the fate of empires. The waters of Salamis became the silent witness to that truth, a reminder that even the most massive armada can sink under the weight of its own arrogance. The Battle of Salamis was supposed to be Xerxes' moment of divine triumph, a final crushing blow to the Greeks that would erase the shame of Marathoth and cement his place among the gods. Instead, it became his undoing. The Persian navy, vast and glittering, was lured into a trap by the smaller Greek fleet. What followed was not a glorious victory, but a disaster on an unimaginable scale. Ships crashed into one another, oars shattered, and the narrow straits turned into a graveyard of burning hulls and drowning men. From his golden throne on the shore, Xerxes watched his navy crumble before his eyes. It was the first time the so-called God King witnessed the limits of his power, and he could not accept it. He had come to Greece with the largest army the ancient world had ever seen. Historians estimate anywhere between 200,000 and 1,000,000 men. He had bridges built across the Hellespont, ordered entire rivers to be diverted, and whipped the sea itself when it destroyed his first bridge. To his subjects, Xerxes seemed unstoppable. But after Salamis, that illusion shattered. The Persians, who once cheered their invincible king, now saw him panic. The Greeks had outsmarted him, and the man who thought himself divine suddenly looked very human. The defeat left Xerxes in shock. He had poured years of preparation, mountains of gold, and the pride of an empire into this invasion. His father Darius had failed at Marathon, and Xerxes swore he would succeed where his father had not. But now, standing on the shore of Salamis surrounded by chaos, he realized his grand dream was sinking with every Persian ship that went under. The God King's pride, once his armor, now became his cage. Instead of regrouping, Xerxes made a desperate choice. He decided to flee. Historians like Herodotus record that his advisors urged him to return to Asia, fearing that the Greeks might cut off his supply lines and trap him. Xerxes agreed. He left his general Mardonius in command of a smaller force to continue the fight, while he himself retreated to Persia. The journey back was long, humiliating, and bitter. The once mighty king, who had marched into Greece at the head of a colossal army, now slunk home with a handful of guards, burdened by the weight of his failure. Imagine the scene: the king of kings trudging across the cold, barren lands of Thrace, his army starving and dying along the way. Supplies had run out. The grandeur of his earlier campaign was gone. There were no golden tents or lavish banquets, no songs of victory. The same man who had demanded the sea be punished for disobedience now faced nature's vengeance firsthand. His men froze, starved, and deserted. Every step back to Persia was a reminder that his godlike power had limits. When Xerxes finally returned to his capital, he was not greeted as a hero. The Persian Empire had spent enormous wealth on this campaign: ships, soldiers, bridges, roads, food, gold, and slaves. The treasury was drained, and the empire's prestige was bruised. Worse, Greece had survived. The small, divided city-states he had hoped to crush were now emboldened. Athens, once burned and humbled, would rise from its ashes to become even stronger. Sparta's legend grew larger than ever. The invasion that was meant to destroy Greek unity had, ironically, created it. Back in Persia, Xerxes' behavior changed. The proud conqueror, who once marched across continents, became reclusive and paranoid. He turned his attention to construction projects, trying to distract himself with grandeur. He expanded his palaces, built towering monuments, and buried himself in luxury. But inside, he knew that the empire's golden image had cracked. Even his advisors could see it. Many of them had died during the campaign, and those who survived were wary of speaking against him. Xerxes began to rely on flatterers rather than real strategists. The court became a place of decadence rather than discipline. Persia was still powerful, but the spark that had once driven its expansion was fading. It is easy to see Xerxes' retreat as an act of cowardice, but, in truth, it was the inevitable result of his hubris. He had built his campaign on the belief that divine will and human arrogance were the same thing. He punished rivers, whipped the sea, and demanded the impossible from men. He thought numbers and fear could substitute for strategy. He ignored his generals when they urged caution. He ignored the limits of supply lines, weather, and terrain. In the end, the natural laws of the world humbled him more effectively than any army could. Think about it. The Persians had overwhelming numbers. They had ships built by the best craftsmen in the empire, soldiers drawn from every corner of Asia, and an emperor who claimed to rule by divine right. But the Greeks had something far more powerful: discipline, cunning, and unity born from desperation. They understood their terrain. They used their smaller size as an advantage. They turned Xerxes' pride against him. The narrow straits of Salamis became their ally, and Xerxes' ego became his downfall. This retreat wasn't just a military withdrawal, it was a collapse of myth. The image of the invincible God King had been destroyed. His army, once the largest on earth, was now scattered across the Aegean, starving and broken. The Persian people, who had worshipped him as a living god, began to question his divinity. No amount of gold or palace walls could hide that truth. In the years that followed, Persia never again attempted a large-scale invasion of Greece. The defeat at Salamis, followed by the later defeat of Mardonius at Plataea, marked the end of Persian expansion into Europe. Xerxes' empire remained vast, but its aura of invincibility was gone. It survived through wealth and administration, not through conquest. His failure showed that even the mightiest empires could falter when led by arrogance instead of wisdom. It's ironic that Xerxes sought immortality through conquest, yet the only immortality he achieved was through his failure. His name lives on, not as the man who conquered Greece, but as the man who lost it all because he believed he couldn't lose. Generations later, historians, poets, and philosophers would use his story as a lesson in pride. Even the Greeks, who feared his armies, pitied his downfall. They saw in him a warning, a reminder that no ruler, no matter how powerful, can command fate. When you strip away the myths, Xerxes' story becomes deeply human. It's about the danger of believing your own legend. He began as a ruler of immense potential. He inherited one of the richest empires in history, with resources that could have lasted for centuries. But instead of securing peace or building prosperity, he gambled it all on revenge and pride. His downfall wasn't caused by the gods, or even by his enemies. It was caused by himself. There as a haunting image that ancient storytellers loved to repeat. Xerxes, sitting alone in his palace years after the invasion, staring out over the plains of Persia, remembering the burning ships at Salamis, in that silence, he finally understood that no man, not even a king, can control everything. The sea he once whipped for defiance had taught him its final lesson. The legacy of Xerxes' failed invasion reshaped history. The survival of Greece allowed Western philosophy, democracy, and art to flourish. The defeat of Persia gave rise to a new age of Greek confidence that would eventually produce Alexander the Great, a man who would, in a twist of irony, conquer Persia itself. Xerxes' empire survived his lifetime, but it never recovered its former glory. His failure set in motion a chain of events that would change the world. And that's the story of how pride destroyed a god-king. Xerxes thought himself untouchable, but in the end, his arrogance left him alone and forgotten by the same gods he claimed to embody. His campaign proved that no amount of power, gold, or soldiers can overcome poor judgment. The man who thought he ruled the world learned that even the greatest kings must bow to reality. If you've followed this far through Xerxes' rise and fall, thank you for watching the full video. If you learned something new, hit the like button, drop a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to Dumb Historian for more stories about history's most foolish decisions. Sometimes the dumbest mistakes make the best lessons.